The silence inside the grand ballroom was louder than applause had ever been. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm golden light, sending shimmering reflections across polished marble floors. Every table was dressed in flawless white linen. Fresh ivory roses filled elegant centerpieces. Silver cutlery gleamed beneath the glow of candlelight, untouched. At the far end of the room, a magnificent five-tier birthday cake stood like a monument to a celebration that had never begun. Yet not a single guest occupied the dozens of beautifully decorated chairs. Only one woman remained. Evelyn Carter sat alone at the head of the 20-seat banquet table, her emerald green evening gown flowing gracefully over the wheelchair she had spent the last 2 years learning to accept but never truly embrace. At 50 years old, she still carried the quiet confidence that had once made boardrooms fall silent when she spoke. Tonight, however, her eyes searched an empty room instead of a crowd. She looked toward the antique grandfather clock beside the marble staircase. 7 o'clock. The official beginning of her birthday celebration. Her fingers tightened gently around the edge of the table. "They'll be here," she whispered, though the words sounded more like a plea than a belief. Nearby, her longtime assistant, Claire Bennett, glanced anxiously at her phone. A vibration. She forced a smile. "Mr. Harrison says an emergency board meeting came up." Another vibration. "Senator Wallace sends his apologies. His flight was delayed." Then another. "A family emergency." Another. "Unexpected travel." Another. "So sorry, rain check." The excuses poured in like falling dominoes, each message polished, polite, and painfully predictable. Within 30 minutes, more than 60 invitations had turned into 60 cancellations. Executives, politicians, celebrities, business partners, relatives, old friends, people who once rearranged entire schedules just for the privilege of being photographed beside Evelyn Carter, now couldn't spare a single evening. The string quartet gradually lowered their instruments. The first violinist exchanged an uncomfortable glance with the cellist before quietly packing away his music. Even the catering staff hesitated near the kitchen entrance, unsure whether to serve dinner for guests who no longer existed. Claire slowly approached Evelyn. "Would you like me to ask the chefs to bring out the meal anyway?" Evelyn stared at the untouched plates arranged around her. "For who?" The words barely escaped her lips. No one answered. The enormous ballroom suddenly felt less like a celebration and more like a museum preserving memories of a life that had quietly disappeared. Just 2 years earlier, this same room had overflowed with laughter. Champagne glasses clinked. Journalists waited outside the gates. Investors competed for invitations. World leaders requested meetings. Every charity gala she hosted raised millions. Every speech inspired standing ovations. Every handshake carried influence. Back then, everyone wanted something from Evelyn Carter. Now, the only thing people seemed to want was distance. Her eyes drifted downward toward the wheelchair beneath the elegant tablecloth. It wasn't the chair itself that hurt. It was everything it had revealed. The accident hadn't taken away her intelligence. It hadn't taken away her company. It hadn't taken away her fortune. But somehow, it had taken away almost everyone she thought loved her. A single tear slipped down her cheek before she quietly wiped it away. "I spent 30 years building an empire," she murmured. She looked around the empty ballroom. "I never realized I'd forgotten to build a family." Claire knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand over hers. "You still have people who care." Evelyn smiled sadly. "If they cared." She looked at another empty chair. "They'd be sitting there." Before Claire could respond, The massive oak front doors swung open, with a deep echo that rolled across the silent ballroom. Every employee turned. Standing in the doorway was a man carrying 3 rain-soaked cardboard boxes. His jacket was damp. His shoes were muddy. There were no photographers behind him. No luxury gifts. No expensive suit. Just tired eyes. And a gentle smile. Claire gasped. "It can't be." Evelyn slowly lifted her head. Her breath caught in her throat. "Daniel." Her ex-husband stood frozen for a moment as he absorbed the heartbreaking scene before him. The untouched food, the abandoned orchestra, the empty chairs, and the woman he had once promised to love for the rest of his life sitting alone on her 50th birthday. Sadness flickered across his face. Then, without hesitation, he walked toward her. He carefully placed the boxes on a nearby table. "I hope," he said softly, "I'm not too late." Evelyn blinked in disbelief. "You came." Her voice trembled. "After everything." Daniel looked into her eyes with a kindness she hadn't seen in years. "I made you a promise once." "What promise?" He smiled. "That no matter what happened between us, I'd never let you face your hardest day alone." The room fell silent. Even the staff stopped moving. Several quietly wiped tears from their eyes. But Daniel hadn't come alone. He reached into his pocket, unlocked his phone, typed a single message, pressed send. Then he looked toward the front door, as if waiting for something. Exactly 90 seconds later, the mansion's doorbell rang. Then it rang again. And again. And again. Within moments, footsteps began filling the entrance hall. Strangers. Dozens of them. People Evelyn had never met, or so she believed. And the first person to step inside carried something far more valuable than an expensive birthday gift. A story that would reveal a side of Evelyn's own life she had never truly seen. What happened next would transform not only Evelyn's birthday, but the meaning of everything she thought she knew about success, love, and the extraordinary power of unnoticed kindness. If this story reminds you that even the smallest act of kindness can echo farther than we ever imagine, I'd be honored if you subscribed. Every story on this channel is created with care to bring hope, compassion, and a reminder that goodness still exists in the world. Your support helps keep these stories coming. Daniel remained standing near the entrance, rainwater slowly dripping from the sleeves of his jacket onto the polished marble floor. Behind him, the mansion's grand doors stayed open, allowing a cool evening breeze to sweep through the silent ballroom. Evelyn Carter could barely take her eyes off him. For nearly 3 years, they had spoken only when absolutely necessary. Brief conversations through attorneys, occasional emails about legal paperwork, and once, a short exchange at a charity board meeting that had ended almost before it began. Yet here he was. Not because he wanted something. Not because the cameras were rolling. Not because anyone expected him to come. He had simply shown up. For a brief moment, the empty chairs around Evelyn seemed less important than the man standing before her. Her mind drifted backward through the years. There had been a time when the name Evelyn Carter inspired admiration across the country. She wasn't born into wealth. She grew up in a modest brick house on the edge of a quiet manufacturing town, where her father repaired broken appliances and her mother taught literature at the local public school. Money was often tight, but her parents filled their home with something far more valuable than luxury: discipline, honesty, and compassion. Her mother had a favorite saying. "Success isn't measured by how many people know your name," she'd tell young Evelyn. "It's measured by how many lives are better because yours crossed theirs." As a teenager, Evelyn admired those words. as an ambitious young entrepreneur. She slowly forgot them. At 24, armed with little more than an old laptop, relentless determination, and an idea most investors dismissed as impossible, Evelyn rented a tiny office above a struggling bakery. The ceiling leaked whenever it rained. The heating barely worked. Sometimes she survived on instant noodles for an entire week, just to pay her employees on time. She refused to quit. When her first investor backed out 2 days before payroll, she sold her own car instead of laying anyone off. When competitors tried to force her business into bankruptcy through lawsuits, she spent nights sleeping on the office couch while preparing legal documents herself. She became known for working harder than everyone else. Her employees noticed something unusual. Even during the hardest times, Evelyn never asked anyone to do a job she wouldn't do herself. She answered customer service calls. She swept the office floor. She helped interns carry heavy boxes. She celebrated every birthday, remembered every child's name, attended weddings, visited sick employees in hospitals. People didn't just work for her. They believed in her. And little by little, the impossible happened. The tiny startup grew into a national technology company, then an international one. Within 15 years, Evelyn Carter had become one of the youngest female CEOs to build a billion-dollar enterprise from scratch. Magazine covers called her the woman who changed modern business. Television hosts praised her leadership. Universities invited her to speak. Awards filled entire shelves inside her office. Yet none of those achievements meant as much to her as the people she worked beside. At least, that's what she believed. Daniel had witnessed every step of that journey. Long before the interviews. Long before the luxury cars. Long before private jets and charity galas. He had fallen in love with a young woman who believed impossible dreams were simply challenges waiting to be solved. They met in the most ordinary way imaginable. One rainy afternoon, Evelyn rushed into the small neighborhood bakery beneath her rented office, frustrated after another investor had rejected her proposal. She ordered coffee, realized she'd forgotten her wallet upstairs. Embarrassed, she apologized and prepared to leave. Before she could walk away, a stranger standing behind her smiled. "I've got this one." She turned. The man wore paint-stained jeans, work boots, and the warmest smile she'd ever seen. "You don't even know me," she protested. He shrugged. "Everyone deserves coffee after surviving a bad day." She laughed. "How do you know I've had a bad day?" "You sighed before you even opened the door." That stranger was Daniel Carter, a local carpenter. His hands were rough from years of building homes. His clothes were simple. His heart was extraordinary. Unlike everyone else who admired Evelyn's growing ambition, Daniel admired her kindness. Or rather, the kindness he believed lived beneath all that ambition. They married 4 years later. The wedding wasn't extravagant. No celebrities. No television cameras. Just family, close friends, homemade food, and enough laughter to fill an entire lifetime. Together, they dreamed of building not only a successful future, but a meaningful one. For several years, they did exactly that. Daniel often joked that he married 2 people. The woman he'd tease and her laptop. Evelyn would laugh, close the computer, and promise to finish work tomorrow instead. Sometimes she kept that promise. Sometimes she didn't. As Evelyn's company expanded across the globe, her calendar became impossibly full. Breakfast meetings, international flights, investor conferences, award ceremonies, board meetings that stretched late into the night. One missed dinner became two. Two became 10. Anniversaries were postponed. Vacations canceled. Phone calls shortened. "I'll make it up to you," she always promised. Daniel believed her. For a while, he never complained about the long hours. He understood her dreams. But he quietly wondered when there would be room for theirs. One evening, he surprised her by cooking her favorite meal. Candles flickered across the dining table. Soft music played in the background. Hours passed. The food grew cold. At nearly midnight, Evelyn finally walked through the front door, exhausted. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Daniel smiled anyway. "You've said that a lot lately." She hugged him tightly. "I just need one more year." He gently kissed her forehead. "I don't need more money, Evelyn." She looked into his eyes. "I need more you." Those words stayed with her, long after she stopped listening to them. Years later, journalists described Evelyn Carter as a woman who had everything. The headlines praised her wealth, her influence, her intelligence, her power, but they never saw the empty chair at her dinner table, or the unanswered messages waiting on her phone, or the growing distance between two people who still loved each other, yet no longer knew how to reach one another. Success had slowly built walls where love once built bridges. Neither of them realized it then. But life was already preparing a lesson neither money nor influence could prevent. And when that lesson finally arrived, it would cost far more than either of them ever imagined. Before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been so focused on building a career or chasing a dream that you realized you were missing precious moments with the people you love? Share your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. There was a saying repeated throughout Carter Technologies. "If Evelyn Carter knows your name, she'll never forget it." New employees heard it during orientation. Veterans smiled whenever it came up. It wasn't just a slogan. It was something people genuinely believed. Despite leading a billion-dollar company, Evelyn had an uncanny ability to remember the little things. She knew whose son had just started college, whose daughter dreamed of becoming a doctor, whose father was recovering from surgery. On Friday afternoons, she often walked through the headquarters without an entourage, stopping at desks to ask questions that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. "How's your mother's physical therapy going, Marcus? Did your little girl enjoy her first day of kindergarten, Emily? Tell me, did your husband finally open that bakery he's always talked about?" People left those conversations feeling seen. That was Evelyn's greatest gift. She made people believe they mattered. Ironically, she never noticed how little time she was leaving for the people who mattered most to her. Daniel noticed. Not because he was keeping score. Because he missed his wife. Their sprawling mansion overlooked a quiet lake just outside the city. It had everything money could buy: floor-to-ceiling windows, a private library, a home theater, gardens that bloomed in every season, and a kitchen larger than the apartment where they had first lived as newlyweds. Yet most evenings, the house echoed with silence. Daniel had never wanted a mansion. He would have traded every square foot of it for one uninterrupted dinner with Evelyn. Instead, he found purpose elsewhere. Unlike many spouses of wealthy executives, Daniel never stopped working. He continued running his small carpentry business, restoring old homes, building custom furniture, and volunteering his skills whenever someone in the community couldn't afford repairs. To him, every project told a story. Every table he built would someday hold family dinners. Every rocking chair would cradle a grandchild. Every porch he repaired would welcome someone home. He believed that craftsmanship wasn't about wood. It was about people. One Saturday morning, He was repairing the front steps of an elderly widow named Mrs. Alvarez. She tried to hand him an envelope when he finished. Daniel smiled and gently pushed it back into her hands. "You've already paid me." She frowned. "I haven't paid you anything." "You made me tea." She laughed. "That hardly counts." "It does to me." From the kitchen window, Mrs. Alvarez watched him load his tools into his old pickup truck. She shook her head and whispered to herself, "The world needs more men like that." Daniel never heard her. He was already driving to his next job. Meanwhile, Evelyn's world moved at a completely different pace. Her days began before sunrise and rarely ended before midnight. Private jets, boardrooms, international conferences, television interviews, charity galas. Her calendar looked less like a schedule and more like a battlefield. Claire, her assistant for nearly 12 years, often worried that Evelyn was running on determination alone. "You skipped lunch again," Claire reminded her one afternoon as they hurried between meetings. "I'll eat on the plane." "You said that yesterday." "I know. And the day before." Evelyn smiled apologetically. "I'll survive." Claire sighed. "That's not what I'm worried about." Despite her exhausting routine, Evelyn remained deeply committed to giving back. Every year, Carter Technologies donated millions to hospitals, scholarship funds, disaster relief, and education initiatives. But Evelyn preferred quieter acts of generosity. Without seeking recognition, she personally paid for life-saving surgeries. She covered tuition for students whose parents had exhausted every option. She quietly cleared medical debts for struggling families. Whenever possible, she insisted that recipients never learn her name. "If gratitude has an address," she once told Claire, "let it be sent to Hope, not to me." Claire admired that philosophy. Still, she noticed something strange. Evelyn rarely stayed long enough to witness the lives she changed. She signed the checks, attended the meetings, made the decisions, then rushed to the next obligation. She planted countless seeds, without ever seeing the gardens they became. One autumn afternoon, while leaving a children's rehabilitation center after approving funding for new therapy equipment, Evelyn noticed a little boy struggling to build a tower from colorful wooden blocks. His legs were supported by braces. Every movement required extraordinary effort. She knelt beside him. "What are you building?" "A castle," he replied. "It looks wonderful." He looked up with a grin. "It keeps falling." Evelyn picked up one of the blocks. Maybe castles aren't supposed to stand alone. Together, they rebuilt the tower. This time it stayed upright. The little boy laughed so loudly that nurses turned to look. His mother wiped away tears. Before leaving, Evelyn handed the boy the tiny wooden block she'd been holding. "Keep this." "Why?" "So whenever your castle falls again." She smiled warmly. "You'll remember it can always be rebuilt." The visit lasted less than 10 minutes. Another appointment awaited. She never learned the boy's name. She never knew that years later, he would still keep that wooden block on his bedside table. At home, Daniel had begun noticing subtle changes. Not in Evelyn's schedule. In her spirit. She laughed less. Smiled less. She seemed permanently exhausted, as though carrying an invisible weight she refused to share. One evening, while watching the sunset over the lake, Daniel finally asked the question he'd been holding back. "Are you happy?" Evelyn looked surprised. "Of course." He waited. She didn't say anything else. Daniel reached for her hand. "You answered too quickly." She looked across the water, avoiding his eyes. "I have everything I've ever worked for." I didn't ask what you have. Silence settled between them. I asked if you're happy. For the first time in a long while. Evelyn didn't know how to answer. The pressure surrounding Carter Technologies continued to grow. Competitors emerged. Investors demanded faster expansion. Shareholders expected record profits every quarter. Every decision carried enormous consequences. Board members praised Evelyn's leadership publicly. Privately, some wondered whether the company had become too dependent on one person. Among them was Richard Holloway, the ambitious chairman of the board. He often smiled during meetings, but his compliments rarely reached his eyes. The company needs stability, he remarked one afternoon. Evelyn is the stability, another director replied. Richard folded his hands thoughtfully. No one is irreplaceable. The room fell quiet. Claire noticed the comment. So did Evelyn. She brushed it aside. But somewhere beneath the polished conversations and corporate smiles, small cracks had already begun to form. Late one evening, Evelyn finally returned home earlier than expected. She found Daniel asleep in the living room. An untouched birthday scrapbook rested on his lap. Curious, she opened it carefully. Inside were photographs spanning nearly 25 years. Their tiny first apartment. Weekend camping trips. Their wedding. Christmas mornings. Road trips. Silly selfies taken before smartphones made perfection fashionable. Tucked inside the final page was a handwritten note. I miss us. Not the younger us. Not the poorer us. Just us. Evelyn stared at the words until her vision blurred. For a long moment, she simply stood there, holding the scrapbook against her chest. She wanted to wake him. To apologize. To promise things would change. Instead, her phone vibrated. An urgent message from the board. An emergency meeting had been scheduled for sunrise. She looked from the glowing screen to the sleeping man on the couch. After a painful hesitation, she quietly kissed his forehead. I'm sorry, she whispered. Then she picked up her laptop and walked into her office. Neither of them realized that within days, one unexpected moment would shatter everything they had spent decades building. And when the dust finally settled, the question would no longer be whether Evelyn was happy. It would be whether she would ever walk again. The morning of the annual Carter Technologies Innovation Summit began like every other high-profile event Evelyn had hosted over the past decade. The city's convention center buzzed with anticipation as journalists adjusted their cameras, executives rehearsed presentations, and hundreds of employees hurried through the halls making final preparations. Outside, banners bearing the company's logo fluttered in the crisp autumn breeze. Inside, thousands of people waited to hear the woman whose vision had transformed an idea into a global empire. Claire handed Evelyn a folder as they walked backstage. You've got 45 minutes until your keynote. After that, the press conference, then lunch with the investors. Evelyn smiled tiredly, and people wonder why I forget to eat. You joke about it, Claire replied, but you haven't had a full night's sleep in weeks. I'll rest after today. Claire had heard those words countless times before. Back at the mansion, Daniel stood in the garage loading handcrafted wooden toys into his pickup truck. He had spent weeks building them for a children's rehabilitation center that Carter Technologies quietly supported. He had hoped Evelyn could come with him after her conference. Before leaving, he called her. She answered on the second ring. Good morning, she said warmly. I just wanted to wish you luck. Thank you. And don't forget. She smiled. I know. You promised we'd have dinner tonight. I'll be there. You mean it. I mean it. Daniel laughed softly. Good, because I'm making your favorite lasagna, and this time I'm not letting it get cold. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Neither of them knew those would be the last ordinary words they would ever share. An hour later, Evelyn stepped onto the massive stage to thunderous applause. Giant screens displayed the company's achievements, while hundreds of flashing cameras illuminated the auditorium. She spoke with the same confidence that had inspired millions before her. We often measure success by profits, market share, and innovation, she told the audience. But the greatest success is using what we've built to improve someone else's life. The crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation. As the applause echoed through the hall, Evelyn felt an unexpected wave of dizziness. She paused for only a second. Claire noticed. "Are you all right?" she whispered from backstage. Evelyn nodded. She continued speaking. No one realized it was the first warning. The remainder of the conference passed without incident. By late afternoon, Evelyn and Claire were traveling back to the mansion in a chauffeured SUV. Dark clouds gathered overhead as rain began falling steadily, turning the highway into a sheet of shimmering reflections. Claire looked out the window. Weather report says visibility is getting worse. We'll be home soon. Evelyn glanced at her phone. A message from Daniel. The lasagna is in the oven. Don't be late this time. Love you. She smiled, then typed back. I'm on my way. Save me the biggest slice. Love you too. It was the last message she would ever send without knowing her life was about to change forever. Several miles ahead, a heavily loaded tractor-trailer struggled to slow as traffic suddenly backed up because of an overturned vehicle. Its brakes failed. The driver slammed the horn. Cars scattered in every direction. Drivers screamed. Tires skidded across the rain-soaked pavement. Evelyn, Claire shouted. The chauffeur fought desperately to regain control. The SUV spun. Everything happened in seconds. Metal twisted. Glass exploded. The deafening sound of impact drowned out every other noise. Then, silence. Rain tapped softly against shattered windows. Steam rose from the crushed engine. Claire slowly opened her eyes, disoriented but conscious. Evelyn. No answer. Evelyn. She turned. Evelyn was trapped beneath the collapsed dashboard, motionless except for shallow breaths. Blood trickled from a cut above her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open. Claire. I'm here. Her voice trembled. I can't feel my legs. Claire's heart stopped. No, don't say that. I can't. Panic filled Evelyn's eyes for the first time in decades. I can't move. Sirens pierced the air in the distance. Firefighters arrived within minutes, cutting through mangled steel while paramedics stabilized both women. Rain poured relentlessly as rescue crews worked with desperate urgency. Daniel's phone rang while he was setting the dinner table. He smiled, assuming Evelyn was calling to say she was running late. Instead, an unfamiliar voice spoke. Is this Daniel Carter? Yes. My name is Officer Reynolds. The pause that followed seemed endless. There's been an accident. The plate slipped from Daniel's hands, shattering across the kitchen floor. At the hospital, surgeons rushed Evelyn into emergency surgery, while Daniel waited outside the operating room, still wearing the flour-stained shirt he had cooked dinner in. Hour after hour passed. Claire sat nearby with a bandaged arm, silently praying. Finally, the lead surgeon emerged. His expression revealed the truth before he spoke. The surgery was successful. Daniel exhaled with relief. But one word. One terrible word. The damage to her spinal cord is extensive. Daniel's face paled. What does that mean? The doctor lowered his eyes. We won't know everything until rehabilitation begins. He hesitated. But it's very likely Mrs. Carter will never walk again. The hallway fell silent. Daniel leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. Inside the recovery room, Evelyn slowly regained consciousness. The first thing she searched for was her legs. She tried to move them. Nothing happened. She tried again. Nothing. Her heartbeat quickened. She pulled at the hospital blanket with trembling hands. No. The word escaped as barely a whisper. No. The machines beside her began beeping faster. Daniel rushed into the room and took her hand. She looked at him with tears streaming down her face. Tell me this is temporary. He couldn't answer. Please. Her voice broke. Tell me they're wrong. Daniel squeezed her hand so tightly it almost hurt. But no matter how desperately he wanted to, he couldn't make a promise that wasn't his to give. That night, while rain continued falling outside the hospital windows, the woman who had once stood before thousands with fearless confidence stared into the darkness, wondering if the life she had spent decades building had ended on a rain-soaked highway. She had no idea. The accident was only the beginning. The greatest heartbreak was still waiting for her. Recovery was supposed to begin with hope. Instead, it began with silence. The first few days after Evelyn's surgery were filled with flowers, cards, and well wishes. Hospital staff struggled to find space for the expensive bouquets that arrived from politicians, celebrities, and business leaders around the world. Television networks praised her resilience. Social media overflowed with messages calling her an inspiration. But as the days turned into weeks, the flowers wilted. The phone stopped ringing. The visitors became fewer. Then they stopped coming altogether. Every morning, Evelyn stared at the door of her hospital room, expecting another familiar face. Most days, only Daniel walked through it. He arrived before sunrise carrying fresh coffee for Claire and a different flower for Evelyn every single day. Some mornings it was a sunflower. Other days, a simple daisy he had picked from a roadside field. He never came empty-handed because he believed that hope, no matter how small, should always have something beautiful to hold on to. Physical therapy was brutal. The rehabilitation center pushed Evelyn harder than she had ever pushed herself in business. She learned how to transfer from her bed to a wheelchair, how to regain balance, and how to perform the simplest daily tasks that she had once taken for granted. The hardest part wasn't the pain. It was hearing the words, "You need help." Help getting dressed. Help getting into bed. Help reaching a shelf. Help taking a shower. The woman who had built an empire from nothing suddenly needed assistance, opening a heavy door. One afternoon, after an exhausting therapy session, Evelyn caught her reflection in a mirror. The wheelchair. The tired eyes. The scar above her forehead. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Daniel rolled beside her and gently smiled. I still see the strongest woman I've ever known. She forced a bitter laugh. No. She looked down at her motionless legs. You see someone she used to be. Daniel knelt in front of her wheelchair. I see my wife. She turned away, unable to meet his eyes. Deep inside, shame had begun replacing confidence. Months later, Evelyn finally returned to Carter Technologies. Claire had arranged a quiet entrance through the underground parking garage to avoid reporters, but word spread quickly. Employees lined the hallway as she entered the headquarters. Many applauded. Some cried. Others simply smiled with genuine relief. Evelyn smiled back, but something felt different. People looked at her with sympathy now. Not admiration. During her first board meeting, she presented a detailed expansion strategy just as she always had. When she finished, silence filled the room. Richard Holloway finally spoke. Perhaps we should postpone such aggressive growth until circumstances become more stable. Evelyn frowned. The company's numbers are stronger than ever. Yes, Richard replied carefully, but investors may question whether you're physically capable of maintaining this pace. The room became uncomfortably quiet. For the first time in 20 years, someone questioned her ability instead of her ideas. After the meeting, Claire wheeled Evelyn back toward her office. You handled that well. No. Evelyn stared ahead. I just realized something. What? They stopped seeing my mind. Claire looked confused. They only see the chair. Outside the office walls, rumors quietly spread. Some shareholders wanted a younger CEO. Others feared instability. Several executives who had once praised Evelyn's leadership suddenly aligned themselves with Richard, believing change would better protect their own positions. The accident hadn't weakened the company. It had revealed people's true loyalties. At home, life wasn't any easier. The mansion had been renovated with ramps, elevators, and accessible bathrooms, but no amount of construction could erase Evelyn's growing sense of isolation. She stopped attending charity events, declined interviews, ignored invitations. Eventually, she stopped reading the messages on her phone altogether. One evening, Daniel found her sitting alone in the library with the lights off. You've been here for hours. I like the quiet. He sat beside her. The quiet isn't helping. It hurts less than pretending. He reached for her hand. You don't have to carry this alone. She slowly pulled her hand away. I already am. Daniel's heart broke. He had stood beside her through every hospital visit, every therapy session, every sleepless night. Yet no matter how close he stayed, she kept drifting farther away. The distance between them no longer came from busy schedules. It came from invisible walls built by grief. Weeks became months. Arguments replaced conversations. Not loud arguments. The quiet kind. The kind where two people stop saying what they really feel because they're afraid of making the other hurt even more. One rainy evening, Daniel prepared dinner just like he always had. The food grew cold. Not because Evelyn was working. Because she never came downstairs. He found her sitting by the bedroom window. You missed dinner. I'm not hungry. You haven't eaten all day. I'm fine. No, he said gently. You're surviving. She closed her eyes. I don't know how to be the woman you married anymore. Daniel walked closer. I didn't marry you because you could walk. She finally looked at him. Then why did you marry me? He smiled through tears. Because you made people believe tomorrow could be better. For a brief moment, she wanted to believe him. But hope felt impossibly far away. As the months passed, the invitations became almost non-existent. The mansion that had once hosted hundreds of guests now stood quiet most weekends. Even relatives found reasons not to visit. Business associates who once called every day suddenly became impossible to reach. On social media, people still praised Evelyn as an icon. In real life, few remembered to ask how she was doing. The final blow came nearly 2 years after the accident. Her 50th birthday. Claire had spent weeks organizing the celebration. More than 60 invitations had been accepted. The ballroom had never looked more beautiful. Evelyn allowed herself to hope. Maybe this would be the beginning of normal life again. Maybe the people she had spent decades supporting hadn't forgotten her after all. But as the clock struck 7, one cancellation became 5. 5 became 20. 20 became 60. Excuse after excuse flooded Claire's phone. Business meetings, travel delays, family emergencies. Not a single reason sounded believable. Within 30 minutes, the ballroom was almost empty. Evelyn looked across dozens of vacant chairs and finally understood the painful truth. Many people had loved being close to her success. Very few loved her enough to stay after her suffering. She lowered her eyes and whispered words that shattered Claire's heart. I thought I had built a life. A tear rolled down her cheek. It turns out, I only built a reputation. And just as the last hope inside her began to fade, the front door of the mansion slowly opened. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and every eye in the ballroom turned toward the entrance. Standing there was Daniel. His jacket was soaked from the evening rain, and a few strands of gray hair clung to his forehead. He wasn't carrying an expensive gift wrapped in satin ribbons or accompanied by photographers eager to capture the moment. Instead, he balanced 3 ordinary cardboard boxes in his arms. For a second, he didn't move. His eyes slowly swept across the ballroom. The untouched buffet. The silent musicians. The towering birthday cake. The dozens of empty chairs. And finally, Evelyn. Alone. His heart sank. No matter how much Claire had tried to prepare him over the phone, nothing could have prepared him for seeing the woman he had once loved sitting by herself on her 50th birthday. He placed the boxes on a nearby table and walked toward her. I hope I'm not too late, he said softly. Evelyn stared at him, struggling to believe he was really standing there. Daniel. 100 emotions rushed through her at once. Shock. Relief. Confusion. Guilt. You came. He smiled gently. I told you once that I'd never let you face your hardest day alone. Her voice trembled. After everything that happened between us. Daniel pulled up a chair beside her wheelchair and sat down. I didn't come because of what happened between us. He looked into her eyes. I came because of who you are. Evelyn looked away. I don't even know who that is anymore. You do. She shook her head. No. The woman I used to be disappeared the day of the accident. Daniel remained quiet for a moment before speaking. No, Evelyn. The accident changed your body. He pointed toward her heart. It never changed this. She gave him a sad smile. You still see me through old memories. No. I see you through the lives you've touched. She frowned. What does that mean? Instead of answering, Daniel stood and walked back to the cardboard boxes. Claire watched curiously. So did the staff. Daniel opened the first box. Inside were hundreds of handwritten letters. The second contained photographs. The third held small keepsakes, drawings made by children, thank you cards, newspaper clippings, handmade ornaments, faded postcards, and dozens of tiny mementos collected over many years. Evelyn looked confused. What are those? Daniel picked up an old envelope. Do you remember paying for a little girl's heart surgery 12 years ago? She thought for a moment. I've helped a lot of children. Exactly. He unfolded the letter. This is from her. He read aloud. Dear Mrs. Carter, you don't know me, but because of you, I got to celebrate my 10th birthday. Today I'm 22 years old and studying to become a pediatric nurse so I can save children the way someone saved me. Thank you for giving me a future. The ballroom fell silent. Daniel reached for another letter. A widowed father whose mortgage you secretly paid after his wife passed away. Another, a veteran who received prosthetic limbs through one of your foundation grants. Another, a college graduate whose scholarship kept him from dropping out. Another, a single mother who opened her own business with the emergency grant you approved. Evelyn listened in stunned silence. She searched her memory. I don't remember any of them. Daniel smiled. That's because you never helped people to be remembered. You helped because it was the right thing to do. He looked around the nearly empty ballroom. The people who abandoned you tonight knew your success. He gently placed a stack of letters in her lap. But these people know your heart. Claire wiped tears from her eyes. So that's what you've been doing. Daniel nodded. The day Evelyn left the hospital, I realized something. What? She spent years changing lives without ever seeing the ending. So I started looking. Over the past 2 years, whenever Daniel had free time, he traveled across the state visiting hospitals, schools, shelters, and neighborhoods funded by Evelyn's generosity. He met people whose lives had been transformed because one successful businesswoman had quietly chosen kindness over recognition. He never told Evelyn. He simply listened, collected their stories, saved their letters, remembered their names. Then 3 weeks before her birthday, he made hundreds of phone calls. Not to celebrities, not to politicians, not to wealthy executives. He called ordinary people. People whose lives had once intersected with Evelyn for only a few moments. He told them one thing. She thinks no one remembers her. Almost every person gave the same answer. Tell me where to be. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He looked at Evelyn. May I show you something? She nodded silently. He typed one short message. She's ready. Then he pressed send. Less than a minute later, the mansion's doorbell rang. Everyone turned. Another ring. Then another. The butler hurried toward the entrance. When he opened the door, an elderly woman stood there holding a homemade apple pie. Behind her was a young firefighter carrying a small gift bag. Then a teenage girl clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. Behind them, more people, and even more. Within moments, the driveway outside the mansion was filled with cars. Families, teachers, construction workers, nurses, veterans, delivery drivers, children. None of them wore designer clothing. None of them arrived with cameras. But every single one of them came carrying something far more valuable. Gratitude. Evelyn looked at Daniel, tears filling her eyes. Who are all these people? He smiled. They're the people who never forgot the kindness you gave them. As the first guest stepped into the ballroom, Evelyn realized something she had never understood during all her years of success. Influence could fill a room, but only love could fill empty chairs. For a few seconds, no one moved. Evelyn sat frozen in her wheelchair as the first guest stepped into the ballroom. An elderly woman walked toward her, holding a homemade apple pie wrapped carefully in a blue towel. I hope you don't mind, she said with a nervous smile. I couldn't afford anything expensive. Before Evelyn could answer, Daniel spoke softly. It's perfect. The woman placed the pie on the table and gently took Evelyn's hands. My name is Margaret Collins. Evelyn searched her memory but couldn't place the face. Margaret smiled. 10 years ago, my husband died from cancer. I lost my home a few months later. I was too proud to ask anyone for help. A tear rolled down her cheek. One morning, someone paid off every cent I owed the bank. She squeezed Evelyn's hands. I later found out it was your foundation. You gave me my home back. My grandchildren still celebrate Christmas in that house because of you." Without thinking, Evelyn stood. At least she tried to. Her body refused. Instead, she leaned forward and embraced Margaret as tightly as she could. I never knew." Margaret whispered, "You were never supposed to." Before Evelyn could gather herself, another guest stepped forward. A young firefighter in uniform. He removed his cap respectfully. "My name is Lucas." He smiled nervously. "When I was 16, my father lost his job. My mom worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table." He reached into his wallet and carefully removed an old scholarship certificate. "You approved this. It paid for the training that made me a firefighter." He laughed. "I've spent the last 8 years rescuing people." He looked directly at Evelyn. "You saved hundreds of lives." She frowned gently. "No." He shook his head. "You saved mine first." More tears filled the room. The string quartet quietly picked up their instruments again. Without anyone asking, they began playing a gentle melody that wrapped around every conversation like a warm embrace. One by one, more guests approached. A young mother carrying a sleeping baby. "You paid for the surgery that allowed my son to breathe on his own." A retired teacher. "You rebuilt our school library after the tornado." A military veteran. "I walked again because your foundation bought my prosthetic legs." A delivery driver. "You paid my daughter's university tuition." A nurse. "You donated the equipment that helped us save hundreds of premature babies." Each story uncovered another act of kindness Evelyn had long forgotten. Each memory became another piece of a puzzle she had never realized she was creating. Claire stood near the doorway, overwhelmed. She had worked beside Evelyn for 12 years. Even she hadn't known the full extent of the lives her employer had quietly changed. Daniel watched everything silently. This wasn't about proving he was right. It was about helping Evelyn see herself through the eyes of people whose lives had been forever changed. Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed from the entrance. "Excuse me." Everyone turned. A young man in his early 20s slowly walked into the ballroom using only a slight limp. In his hand was a small wooden block. Evelyn's eyes widened. He smiled. "I've been hoping I'd get the chance to return this." Confused, she looked at the tiny piece of wood. Then her eyes filled with recognition. "The castle." He nodded. "You came to the Children's Rehabilitation Center when I was 9. You helped me build a castle after it kept falling apart." He held up the worn wooden block. "You told me to keep this. So whenever my castle fell again, I'd remember it could always be rebuilt." His voice cracked. "I carried it through every surgery, every therapy session, every setback." He smiled through tears. "Today I'm an architect." The ballroom erupted into applause. Evelyn covered her mouth, unable to stop crying. "I don't even remember your name." He laughed. "I know, but I remembered yours every single day." Daniel quietly walked to the birthday cake. He picked up a lighter and looked around the room. "I think it's finally time." One by one, the candles were lit. Not by servants, not by executives, but by the people whose lives had been touched by Evelyn's compassion. Each person lit one candle. By the time they finished, the cake glowed with 50 tiny flames. Daniel wheeled Evelyn closer. "This room looked empty an hour ago." He looked around at the smiling faces. "It turns out, you invited the wrong people." Laughter mixed with tears. Just then, the mansion doors opened once more. Claire frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone else. A nervous young man stepped inside carrying a camera. I'm sorry to interrupt. He looked embarrassed. I deliver packages for the neighborhood. He held out a small envelope. I heard what was happening tonight. I just wanted to say thank you. Evelyn looked puzzled. I don't think we've met. We haven't. My mother worked as a janitor at one of your office buildings. One night you found her crying after work. You sat with her for almost an hour. You never knew I was waiting outside. He swallowed hard. You convinced her not to give up after my father's death. If you had... His voice broke. I don't think she'd still be here. The room was silent again. Evelyn realized something extraordinary. She had spent years believing that success came from the decisions made in boardrooms. Yet the moments people remembered most were the quiet conversations, the unnoticed encouragement, the kindness no one else had witnessed. Daniel leaned closer. Do you understand now? She nodded through tears. I thought everyone had forgotten me. He smiled warmly. No. The people who mattered. They never could. As the guests gathered around the glowing birthday cake, they began singing Happy Birthday. Not perfectly. Some sang off-key. Children giggled. An elderly veteran forgot part of the lyrics. Someone laughed halfway through. It wasn't polished. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the glamorous celebration Evelyn had planned. It was something infinitely more precious. It was real. When the song ended, Daniel looked at her. Make a wish. Evelyn closed her eyes. For the first time since the accident, she didn't wish to walk again. She wished never to forget what truly made a life meaningful. She opened her eyes, smiled, and blew out every candle. The room exploded with cheers. But none of them knew. The kindness shared that night was only the beginning. By sunrise, the story of one forgotten birthday would spread far beyond the walls of the mansion, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform thousands more lives. The morning after Evelyn's birthday, she woke expecting to discover it had all been a dream. For several quiet moments, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Then she noticed something resting on her bedside table. The small wooden block. The one the young architect had returned to her the night before. She picked it up and smiled through tear-filled eyes. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel defined by what she had lost. She felt grateful for what she had unknowingly built. Downstairs, the kitchen was unusually busy. Daniel was making pancakes, while Claire sorted through a growing stack of envelopes. What are those? Evelyn asked as Daniel wheeled her to the table. Claire looked up with a smile. They started arriving before sunrise. She handed Evelyn the first envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Mrs. Carter, I wasn't able to attend your birthday, but your foundation paid for my son's hearing implant 8 years ago. Today he plays the piano. Thank you for giving us music. The second letter came from a woman in another state. You don't know me, but your emergency grant kept my family off the streets after our house burned down. The third contained a photograph of a smiling family standing in front of a small grocery store. This business exists because you believed in me when the bank didn't. By lunchtime, more than 300 letters had arrived. By evening, there were over 1,000. Daniel looked at Evelyn and said, I think the world is trying to tell you something. She smiled softly. I spent years chasing recognition. She ran her fingers across another handwritten letter. But these are worth more than every award I've ever received. The story of the empty birthday ballroom spread quickly. Not because of gossip. Because one of the young firefighters had posted a simple photograph online. It showed Evelyn sitting in her wheelchair, surrounded by ordinary people, all smiling as if they had known one another forever. The caption read, "Power attracts people, kindness keeps them." Within hours, millions had viewed the post. News stations requested interviews. Television producers called nonstop. Reporters camped outside the mansion. Evelyn declined every invitation. She wasn't interested in becoming famous for being lonely. Instead, she called an emergency meeting with the board of Carter Technologies. When she entered the boardroom a week later, every director stood. Richard Holloway cleared his throat. "We're glad you're feeling better." Evelyn smiled politely. "I finally am." She placed a thick folder on the conference table. "I've spent the last week reading over 2,000 letters." The room grew quiet. "Those letters reminded me why I started this company." She looked around the table. "We've measured success the wrong way." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "We celebrate profits." She paused. "But we've forgotten people." One director nodded thoughtfully. Another leaned forward. Evelyn continued. "Starting today, Carter Technologies will launch the Human Impact Initiative." She unveiled a bold new plan. Every employee would receive paid volunteer days each year. The company would create emergency hardship funds for workers facing personal crises. Scholarship programs would be expanded. Employees could nominate strangers in need for anonymous acts of kindness. Mental health services would become free for every staff member and their immediate families. No shareholders objected. Not after reading the letters. Even Richard remained silent. For the first time in years, the boardroom wasn't discussing quarterly earnings. It was discussing human lives. The changes reached far beyond the company. Other businesses began copying the programs. Small businesses created community kindness funds. Schools introduced acts of compassion, projects inspired by Evelyn's story. Neighborhoods organized volunteer weekends. Hospitals received anonymous donations from people who simply wrote, "Someone once helped me. Now it's my turn." The ripple continued spreading. One afternoon, Evelyn and Daniel visited the Children's Rehabilitation Center, where the little boy with the wooden blocks had once been a patient. Only now he wasn't a little boy anymore. Nathan greeted them, with blueprints tucked under his arm. "I've got something to show you." He led them outside to an empty piece of land beside the hospital. "What is this?" Evelyn asked. He smiled. "The future." He unfolded the drawings. A beautiful therapy center. Wheelchair-accessible playgrounds. Gardens designed for children with disabilities. Family counseling spaces. Art studios. Reading rooms. "I've been designing this for years." He looked at the wooden block in Evelyn's hand. It all started with a castle that kept falling. Evelyn couldn't hold back her tears. "You inspired all this." Nathan shook his head. "No. You believed in me before I believed in myself." Weeks later, construction began. Volunteers arrived from every corner of the city. Some donated materials. Others donated time. Carpenters, electricians, teachers, retired engineers, teenagers. Families brought food for workers. Children painted encouraging messages on temporary fences. It no longer belonged to one person. It belonged to an entire community. Daniel stood beside Evelyn as they watched volunteers working together. "You see that?" "What?" "The night of your birthday." He smiled. "You thought your life was falling apart. She nodded. It was actually multiplying. Months passed. The therapy center opened with laughter echoing through every hallway. Children who had once struggled to find accessible places to play raced across specially designed playgrounds. Parents hugged one another. Doctors smiled. Teachers cried. A small bronze plaque stood near the entrance. It didn't mention wealth. It didn't mention business success. It simply read, "One act of kindness can become thousands. Keep it going." Evelyn traced the words with her fingertips. She finally understood. Kindness didn't end with the person who gave it. It continued through every person who chose to pass it on. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel rolled Evelyn toward the lake behind their home. The same lake where years earlier she had struggled to answer one simple question. "Are you happy?" He looked at her again. "So?" He smiled. "I'll ask one more time." Evelyn watched the golden light dance across the water. Children's laughter echoed from the distance. She reached for Daniel's hand. This time, she didn't let go. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm finally measuring my life by the right things." The journey that had begun with an empty ballroom had filled countless hearts. But there was still one chapter left to write. A chapter that would bring everything full circle in a way neither Evelyn nor Daniel could have imagined. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of the Carter mansion looked almost identical. The same crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. The same marble floors reflected the warm glow of candlelight. Fresh white roses decorated every table. A birthday cake stood proudly in the center of the room. But this time, the silence was gone. Long before the celebration officially began, laughter echoed through every corner of the mansion. Children chased one another between the tables. Elderly couples shared stories over cups of coffee. Nurses, firefighters, teachers, veterans, construction workers, students, and families filled every seat. There were no reserved tables for celebrities. No special section for politicians. No velvet ropes separating important people from ordinary ones. Because Evelyn had finally learned something that changed her life forever. There are no ordinary people. Only extraordinary hearts waiting to be seen. As she entered the ballroom in her wheelchair, the room erupted into applause. Not because she was a billionaire. Not because she was a famous CEO. But because she had become family to people who once believed they were forgotten. Margaret rushed over with another homemade apple pie. "I wasn't going to miss this birthday." Lucas, still wearing his firefighter uniform after a long shift, laughed. "I even traded weekends to make sure I could come." Nathan rolled over a beautifully crafted wooden model of the rehabilitation center. "I made one for your office." Evelyn looked around the room, overwhelmed. A year earlier, she had counted empty chairs. Tonight, there wasn't a single one left. Daniel wheeled beside her and smiled. "I think we underestimated how many birthdays one person can create." She looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the crowd. "Every one of these people is celebrating more than your birthday. They're celebrating the day someone chose kindness instead of walking away." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. For years, she had believed her greatest achievement was building a billion-dollar company. Now she understood. Her greatest achievement had never appeared on a balance sheet. It was written in human lives. As dinner came to an end, Claire gently tapped her glass. "I think someone has something to say." The room became quiet. Evelyn slowly wheeled herself to the front of the ballroom. She looked at the faces before her. Some smiled. Others were already crying. She took a deep breath. "A year ago, I sat in this very room believing I had lost everything. She paused. I thought success had abandoned me. She smiled softly. But I was wrong. I hadn't lost my life. I had simply been looking for it in the wrong places. She looked toward Daniel. When I couldn't see my own worth anymore. Someone reminded me that kindness leaves footprints long after we're gone. She turned back to the crowd. Every letter you wrote. Every story you shared. Every hug you gave me. You didn't just save my birthday. You saved me. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the musicians quietly wiped away tears. Evelyn continued. I spent years believing I was changing the world through money. She gently shook her head. But money was never the miracle. She placed her hand over her heart. Love was. The room stood together in a long, heartfelt standing ovation. Daniel walked to her side. Without saying a word, he reached for her hand. She held it tightly. This time, neither of them let go. The years of pain, the misunderstandings, the distance, none of it disappeared overnight. But forgiveness had quietly built a bridge where pride had once built walls. They had found each other again. Not as the couple they used to be, but as two people who finally understood what truly mattered. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home, Evelyn and Daniel sat on the back terrace overlooking the peaceful lake. The stars reflected on the calm water. A gentle breeze carried the distant sound of children laughing from the new rehabilitation center across the hill. Daniel broke the silence. Do you remember what you told me after the accident? Evelyn smiled sadly. I said the woman you married was gone. He nodded. You were wrong. She looked at him. I know. The strongest version of you. He squeezed her hand. Was born after the accident. She rested her head gently against his shoulder. For the first time in years, neither of them felt the need to speak. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. Before going inside, Evelyn looked back at the ballroom through the large glass windows. She remembered the lonely woman who had stared at 60 empty chairs. She wished she could whisper something to that version of herself. She smiled. Don't count the people who leave. Treasure the ones who stay. Because in the end, success wasn't measured by the size of your house, the balance in your bank account, the title on your office door, or the number of people who applauded when life was easy. Success was measured by the lives that became brighter because you chose kindness when no one was watching. And sometimes, the smallest act of compassion became the greatest legacy a person could ever leave behind. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that kindness is never wasted. Every comment, every like, and every subscription helps these stories reach more people who could use a little hope. Thank you for spending this time with us, and until next time, never underestimate the power of showing up for someone when the rest of the world walks away.